Hello everyone. Okay, so this lesson recording I'm going to do now is going to be about the influence which minor parties play on the UK political system. Now, I think this is the most likely type of question you're going to get about minor parties. And I think the only real question I can really ask is, do they play an influential role or do they not play an influential role? So I think the questions will be along the lines of evaluate the view that the only parties that matter is Labour and Conservatives. Or you might get evaluate the view that minor parties are playing an increasingly important role in the UK political system, or evaluate the view that minor parties have never played an increasing role or never played an influential role in the UK political system. Something like that. So I think they're likely to be around this idea about are they influential, are they not influential? And with that in mind, that table in your booklet was designed to make you think about some points around this. Because what I tried to do is match the table to what are the main functions of political parties as your kind of basis. However, I didn't mean to change this last year. I think that line about recruitment of politicians is not the best one because they kind of all do that, don't they, to some extent. So if I was doing an essay on this, let's say the question was, evaluate the view that minor parties are no longer important or something like that. Obviously, you'd have your argument introduction. They are important or they're not, whatever your view is. And I think my main paragraphs, I think I do one around what influence do minor parties play over the policy agenda, the direction of the country, and influence over the other parties for that agenda. What kind of representation do they have in elected assemblies, i.e. parliaments? And again, the influence that might bestow. You could do one around public support, I suppose, and you could do one about, some parties have a lot of public support, therefore might have quite a lot of influence. And I think I do one around forming governments. Again, it's the ultimate form of influence, isn't it? Do they play a role in decision making? So I think they would be in my paragraphs. Obviously, in the exam, you probably only have 3 of those, not 4, due to your speed of writing. So I'm going to go through for each of these areas. Some arguments to say yes, they are influential, and no, they're not. So let's do first of all public support, and not public support. Let's do influence over policies and the policy direction. So I think the most important party, which has had a big impact on the other parties, had a really big impact on the policy direction of the country, has been UKIP, stroke the Brexit Party. Now, although they don't have much representation in Parliament, they did cause a huge amount of fear for David Cameron's Conservatives, because the Brexit Party, obviously their main issue has been about leaving the EU. Sorry, I've got Zengi on my knee. Their main issue has been about leaving the EU, and obviously they were gaining lots and lots of votes in various European elections and things over the 2000s. This caused a great deal of fear for David Cameron, who thought, they might threaten a future Conservative election victory. 2 of his backbench MPs had already left his party to join UKIP. So this led to David Cameron saying, I think we ought to have a referendum over the EU. And as we know, that's had the consequences of Britain voting to leave, and, it's kind of dominated politics, hasn't it, over the last 4 years. And so you could argue that UKIP had a huge impact over David Cameron's decision making, and therefore had a big impact over the decision to have the referendum, and then subsequently what's happened since. So I think they've had the biggest impact on policy. In terms of other parties, you could make an argument, say the SNP have had some influence as well at UK politics and the policy agenda, because obviously they've been gaining lots of votes in Scotland. Although David Cameron kind of feared them a bit less than UKIP because they weren't taking away Conservative votes, he did grant them that referendum, didn't he, in Scotland in 2014, which I know the Scots lost, or the independence movement lost. But again, you could argue it's had some influence because more powers have subsequently been transferred into Scotland. So again, there's an argument there for the SNP also having some influence over policy agenda. In terms of not having an influence, you could probably mention most of the parties. I mean, don't do. We just mentioned one or two. I mean, like the Greens, for example. Yes, you could argue that, well, the major parties are now talking about green issues, about, cutting carbon emissions to zero by the 2030s and all that kind of stuff. But I would argue that isn't really down to the Green Party. That is more down to the scientists becoming more united about the issue of climate change and giving advice to governments. It's probably down to the public being much more aware of climate change as well, as you can see some of the effects on the country. And you might say it's down to some pressure groups, David Attenborough as well, and all that stuff he's been involved in, Greta Thunberg and all that business. So you might say it's not down to the Greens so much, it's down to these other factors. Okay, I'm sure the Green Party would disagree with my little statement there, so, do feel free to disagree if you so wish. Other factors, representation in elected bodies, i.e. parliaments. Now, again, some parties, minor parties, have had much more influence and much more successful at this. If we look at the House of Commons, the UK Parliament, I think the only party you could say that's been kind of influential here or successful here is the Scottish National Party. You could argue in 2015 when they swept the board and took 55 out of 59 seats in Scotland at the House of Commons, ever since then they've been the third largest party. So currently they've got 47 MPs, so which means they can ask an extra question at Prime Minister's question time. So you could argue they've been really successful here. In terms of influence, it's a bit more difficult because the current government have got quite a big majority, and therefore it doesn't really matter to them if the SNP vote against them, which they usually do. You might say it had a big influence on the Labour Party because a lot of the seats which the Scottish National Party won in 2015 and again in 2019 were seats which Labour used to hold, and therefore you could argue it's had a real big influence over weakening the Labour Party and possibly preventing them from winning the election in 2015. So there's some arguments there. You might argue that quite a few minor parties are much more influential at a more local level. So, for example, the Scottish Parliament is dominated by the Scottish National Party. In Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Assembly is dominated by the DUP and Sinn Féin. They kind of share power. Therefore, at a more regional level, these parties are much more influential. Counterpoints to all this would be, well, yes, the SNP have got 47 seats, well done, but actually, with a big government majority of 80 or whatever it is, they don't really have much sway over things. And then other parties have very few seats in the House of Commons. So like the Greens have got one, the DUP, I think it's 10, I forget how many they've got. Plaid Cymru have got a couple of seats as well, 3 or 4 seats. So again, they don't really play an influential role in that respect. Okay, other areas, public support. Again, and you might say this provides influence, you've got AO2 about why that is influential, because obviously public support, the main party is always keen to win as many seats as they can, and they're often quite sensitive to where the public are on issues. You could have argued, I suppose, that Brexit UKIP party were quite influential by having lots of public support, which probably led to that referendum in 2016, or whatever year it was. You might argue that the Brexit Party did really well at the European elections this summer. Now, I don't think it led to the downfall of Theresa May, but it kind of suggested they were still there, still an influential force potentially, which may have, made it easier for Boris Johnson to go down his hard Brexit line, arguably. You might argue the Scottish National Party quite influential because, again, they seem to have a lot of public support in Scotland, shown by the fact they win all those seats, but also they've got a large membership as well, 118,000 members. So again, that gives them that kind of legitimacy, that kind of kudos and that kind of power. In terms of public support not being that important, again, you could say, well, the Greens have got 800,000 votes. Oh, thank you, Zengi. The Greens have 800,000 votes, but only one MP, and not a huge amount of influence. So therefore, public support might not be the main reason for why some have got influence. And then finally, forming government. We might say this is the ultimate type of influence, isn't it? If a small party is in government somewhere, again, it can get its agenda across, its ideas across, and have a real big impact. Currently, again, I think you'd argue the SNP are the most successful here because they form governments in Scotland